Wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Thanks once again for tuning in, taking the time to watch another presentation. I really appreciate that. So today, we're going to get to the point very quick. We're going to be talking about the real founder of Chicago. I'm going to show you guys who that was. Hope you enjoy the presentation. Let's just get started. So we're going to be reading from this book. And it says here, History of Chicago, from the earliest period to the present time. And we're in volume 1. This is from 1884. And we're going to go right into about page 70 of this book. It says here, Modern Chicago and its settlement. Baptiste Pointe Du Sable, a handsome Negro, well educated and settled at Chicago, but much in the French interest. This apparently unimportant fact, recorded July 4th, 1779 by Colonel Arndt Schuler de Heister, then British commander at Michilimackinac, is the initial point from which may be traced the growth of Chicago, from a single rude cabin on the sand point at the mouth of the river to the magnificent city which stands today, the type of modern progressive civilization. What was Chicago in 1779, and why did this handsome and well-educated pioneer settle here? And again, they're talking about Baptiste Pointe Du Sable. Now, was Chicago really just a rude cabin, or was it something else? What's up with these buildings in the World Fair, right? How Chicago looked like Rome? Something to ponder. Colonel de Peister says, elsewhere in the volume of Miscellanies, from which the above statement is quoted, Chicago is a river and fort at the head of a lake, Michigan. Possibly the fort where Durantaye commanded was alluded to, or the French under Siete might have built a fort at Chicago, as they desired to do when on their way to join the Canadian force at Green Bay and make war on the Foxes of Fox River in the spring of 1729. When de Peyster wrote of Chicago, in his first settler, the French lilies had been lowered from Fort Chartres, and Louisiana was in the hands of the English. It had been British soil. 14 years before there is any record of a person curious enough to penetrate the country north of the Illinois and make a home on the shore of Lake Michigan. The biography of Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable, the pioneer settler of Chicago, is very brief. He was a native of Santo Domingo, all right, Haiti, well educated and handsome. Before settling on the banks of the Chicago River, he had lived among the Peorias with a friend named Glamorgan, also a Domingoan, all right. He was living with the Indians with another friend from Haiti, who was reputed to be possessor of large Spanish land grants near St. Louis. His friend had a lot of Spanish land grants. You hear that? In St. Louis. And to the home of this friend, he returned to die in 1796. By the Treaty of Ryswick, September 20, 1697, the western portion of the island of Haiti was ceded to France, the French colony thereafter taking the name of the island, while the Spanish colony founded in 1496 on the eastern shore retained its old name of Santo Domingo. From the time of this treaty, the Spanish colony made little progress for half a century, while the Haitian colony rapidly grew rich and prosperous, soon becoming one of the most valuable possessions of France. Among its population were a large number of free colored people, free, all right, free, mostly mulattoes, many of whom had received a liberal education in France. All right, they had been educated in France. What kind of free colored people are this? And possessed large estates. Who's the real slave owners? Continue a little ahead, it says here, of the two Domingoan or Haitian friends settled at Peoria, Glamorgan was worldly wise, and with many others who sought favor with the Spanish government, received his rewards and lands near St. Louis. Baptiste Pointe Du Sable remained faithful to the French, and finally left his home to make another among the Potawatomis of Chicago. All right, he went to live with the Indians. He built his cabin on the north bank of the Chicago River, where it turned to the south, near its mouth, and at the head of the point of sand which extended thence between the river and the lake. Here he lived until 1796, 17 years. All that is known of his life during that long period is gathered from the recollections of Augustin Grignon of Butte des Morts near Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and published in the third volume of the Wisconsin Historical Society's collections. Mr. Grignon says, at a very early period, there was a Negro lived there, Chicago, named Baptiste Pointe Du Sable. My brother Parish Grignon visited Chicago about 1794 and told me that Pointe Du Sable was a large man, that he had a commission for some office, but for what particular office or from what government, I cannot now recollect. All right, they said he was working for somebody. You hear that? He was a trader, pretty wealthy, a wealthy trader, and drank freely. I know not what became of him. About all that can be added to the few particulars related above is that in 1796 he sold his cabin to one Lemay, a French trader, another French guy, and returned to Peoria, where he died at the home of his old friend, Glamorgan. It may be true, as is related, that he sought to place himself at the head of the Potawatomis as their chief. He wanted to be their chief. You guys hear that? If true, his desire was ungratified, and Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable, handsome, rich, and faithful though he was, left his home washed by the waters of Lake Michigan and the Chicago River. Not only the first landed proprietor, all right, the first proprietor, all right, again, so-called Negro man of Chicago, right, first proprietor, but also the first disappointed man of Chicago, the first disappointed man of Chicago. LeMay, the second dweller in the cabin on the Sandpoint, made some improvements and occupied it as his home and trading house until 1804. During the years of DuSable's residence in Chicago, the place had become well known to the Indian traders of Mackinac and Detroit. All right, so that's a little story here on Jean Baptiste, letting you know the earliest proprietor, literally founder of Chicago. He's the one that first established a house there, a settlement, and commerce between the Indians, business. He made that the spot. Real quick, we're going to read from the Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society, Volume 56, Number 3. The journal article name is Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable, the first Chicagoan, all right? The first Chicagoan. So this is by Thomas A. Meehan, right? It says here on March 4th, 1963, Chicago celebrated her 126th anniversary as a city. It was 130 years in August that the straggling little village and trading post at the southwestern end of Lake Michigan was incorporated as a town in the state of Illinois. But it was in 1837, with a population of 4,170, that Chicago made her debut as a city. In the brief course of a century and a quarter, she has grown and expanded until today. She ranks 11th among the cities of the world. Since she assumes worldwide importance and interest, her story is the world's story. Naturally, therefore, one would like to find the true history of her beginnings. It would indeed be rash to consider Chicago's history as beginning on March 4, 1837. Over 150 years before that date, Chicago was known to the Indians and to the French, woodsmen, trappers, and missionaries. What French, huh? The French, remember, they call them French. And a little more ahead, it says here, the man who made the first permanent settlement, right, the first permanent settlement in Chicago was Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable, a Negro, all right, a Negro. But there were others before him, and their works, though not enduring, at least contributed to the making of Chicago. And yeah, many explorers that never settled, a lot of black Europeans as well. But Jean-Baptiste was the first, the founder, settler, permanent settler of Chicago. Continue a little more ahead, it says the title, Father of Chicago or First Chicagoan, has been given to many. Mrs. John H. Kinsey claims it for her father-in-law, John Kinsey. All right, so if you guys don't know, this guy had the title as being the first founder, of course, you know, because they didn't want to give it to Jean-Baptiste Du Sable because he was a so-called Negro man. So for many years, this guy had the title. Concerning him, she has woven a story more fanciful than true, and which, among other things, she says, all right, she's making up a lot of things, they're saying. This gentleman was for nearly 20 years, with the exception of the military, the only so called white inhabitant of northern Illinois. You hear that? So well did she voice her tale on a non critical age that even today many look upon him as Chicago's first permanent settler. Coffee, in an early work, urges the honor for Captain John Whistler, builder and first commandant of Fort Dearborn, and James Ryan Hayden has devoted an entire book to the claim of Thomas J. V. Owen, government Indian agent and president of the first boards of trustees of the town of Chicago. All right, so all these people trying to take the claim, right, that they were the first founders, pioneers, settlers of Chicago. But in spite of these various assertions, the title in honor of First Chicagoan belongs to Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable, a man whose claim can be substantiated by at least three contemporary documents. He resided in Chicago for almost 20 years, reared two children there, and even in the last years of his residence saw a grandchild born in almost the heart of the present-day city. All right, you guys hear that? Three generations. At the close of the 18th century and at the very dawn of the 19th, DuSable, a Negro or mulatto, so which one is it? Had a spacious, cultivated, and well-stocked farm. All right. Remember, he was wealthy. He was big. They're saying he was handsome. They're giving him this guy a lot of good attributes, right? Together with a mill and an Indian trading post. All right, he had all this on the very site that today is studded with skyscrapers and ribboned with drives, streets, and boulevards, right? From this ingenious, resourceful, and seemingly well educated Negro, well educated, Chicago draws her permanency. You guys hear that? There are many gaps in the life of DuSable, which are as yet unfilled. Many details are unknown, and not a few are hazy. One of the shadowy periods of his life is its beginning. Where and when was he born? Who were his parents? There are questions to which we do not yet have the answers. You see this? So if they can't tell you who his parents are, how are you going to let people conjecture and tell you, oh, they're from Africa or they're the so-called white man of white French man? The qualities and characteristics of DuSable, which make Coiffe speculate that he was of a famous French family, could also be accounted for by accepting the usual tradition. By the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, the Spanish ceded the western part of Haiti to the French, who had come there as early as 1638 and had had definite settlements in 1659. Negroes had been imported into Haiti and Santo Domingo. All right, dodge the hijack when they say that, because remember, we got all these slavery videos, all these American Indians being taken to Haiti and Santo Domingo, and they were being classified as Negroes. And also, we know Black French, Black Irish, Sephardic Jews, Moors, all these people were also being sent there from Europe and classified as Negroes. So don't just automatically think African when they're saying Negroes. We've broken this down many times. So it says Negroes had been imported to Haiti and Santo Domingo since the year 1517, and mixed bloods were common. Under the French regime, many of the Negroes were cultured and well educated and became landowners of wealth. All right, many of the Negroes were what? The actual plantation owners. Many of them, because of the kind treatment of the French, migrated to Louisiana and thence up the Mississippi to various other French possessions. Beyond these two facts, there is another which strongly supports the tradition that DuSable derived from Santo Domingo. About the year 1720, Philippe Renault arrived at Fort Chartres with Negro slaves from Santo Domingo. In 1723, a large tract of land situated about 5 miles from the fort was granted to him, as well as another tract of 14,000 acres near Peoria. This last fact is important for the reason that in 1783, Pointe Du Sable proved U.S. citizenship in order to receive a land grant from the government of the United States by showing that he had developed a farm in the vicinity of Peoria as early as 1780, all right? DuSable got a land grant. He's not no slave. From these facts, it seems possible that DuSable could have had a French name. Of course he did. What are they talking about? Have spoken their language, have been fairly cultured, and still have been a Santo Domingan or one of their descendants, since the Santo Domingans were exposed to French culture. So do you guys hear what they're trying to explain? This guy is being treated like a Frenchman. He's literally given land grants as a Frenchman. So they're saying even though he's coming from Haiti, he must be still considered French or be in the culture. Yeah, his dad is French, guys. His dad is a black French. And they're going to tell you his mom was a free person of color. None of them were slaves. So he must have been exposed to French culture for more than 120 years before Pointe Du Sable is mentioned in contemporary records. As to when he was born and who his parents were, absolutely nothing is known. They don't know. Our first definite knowledge about him dates from 1779 and appears in an official report by Colonel Aaron Schuler, the Priester, British commandant of Mackinac, who mentions him as Baptiste Pointe Du Sable, a handsome Negro, well educated and settled at Chicago, but much into French interest. All right, much into French interest. This report was entered on July 4, 1779. A few months later, a report from Lieutenant Thomas Bennett of the King's Regiment to his commander at Mackinac reads, I had the Negro Baptiste Pointe Du Sable brought prisoner to Detroit from the river Du Chemin. Corporal Tascan, who commanded the party, very prudently prevented the Indians from burning his home or doing him any injury. He secured his packs, etc., which he takes with him to Michilimackinac. The Negro, since his imprisonment, has in every respect behaved in a manner becoming to a man in his situation, and has many friends who give him a good character. From these two reports, we get a pleasant introduction to the first Chicagoan. Whatever his beginning might have been, he was now a man of a station. The reports were made by two educated men, officers in the British Army, and one calls DuSable well educated, and the other pays him a compliment of which no gentleman need be ashamed. He behaved in a manner becoming to a man in his situation. So basically, what they're trying to explain, he's not just any so-called Negro slave. They're treating him like a gentleman. It says here the religion of the first Chicagoan was Catholic. From all extant records, he appears to have been as practical in observing his religion as was possible. Further ahead, it says Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable took a Potawatomi wife named Catherine sometime in the 1770s, all right? Showing a lot of pictures of the Potawatomi from the 1800s, very dark complexion people. All right, so he took on an American indigenous wife, okay? This so-called Negro, huh? In 1778, he had this marriage solemnized before a Catholic priest in Cahokia, in the mountains, what? Illinois, some 280 miles from Chicago. By this wife, he had two children. Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable Jr. and Suzanne was married in either 1793 or 1794 to Jean-Baptiste Peltier by one of the priests from either Cahokia or Prairie du Roger, Illinois. Suzanne later had her daughter Eulalia, baptized in the Catholic Church in St. Louis by the acting pastor, Father Luson, a Franciscan, on October 7, 1799. To Father Luson, we are indebted for the statement preserved in the records in St. Louis Cathedral that Eulalia was the daughter of a legitimate marriage between Jean-Baptiste Peltier and Suzanne Pointe Du Sable, his spouse, inhabitants of Chicago. All right, so I just wanted to read this article to you guys. Let's keep moving. All right, before I get into some more books here, just want to show you what they have on Wikipedia here for Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable. And as you guys can see, they have this image here. Does that look like a so-called Negro to you, the way they drew it? It says Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable. There are no known portraits of Pointe Du Sable made during his lifetime. This depiction is taken from A.T. Andrea's 1884 book, History of Chicago, all right? Come on now. So even in Wikipedia, it says he is recognized as the founder of Chicago. So regarding his wife, right, and the people he got involved with was a Potawatomi American Indian woman. I have some images of some of the Potawatomi Indians I found online, and from the 1800s, a lot of them. As you guys can see, this person right here, that's him in the middle again. Here on the left, we got another Potawatomi man, right? With a lot of them have like the turban. Another, this is Kona Paka, a Potawatomi medicine man. This is a drawing of James Otto Lewis, a Potawatomi chief. All right, as you guys can see. All right. This right here is John Shab Nay, a Potawatomi man. This is Potawatomi group right here. All right, let me zoom in. See, Potawatomi Indians. I just wanted to show you guys that, just to have a reference. You see, copper-colored tribes of America. So real quick, in this book, Chicago Portraits by June Skinner Sawyers, biographies of 250 famous Chicagoans, forward by Bill Curtis. So just real quick, we're gonna go here, a page they have on Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable. And of course, you gotta dodge the hijack. They're gonna say of French and African American ancestry. Let's zoom in a little bit. Dodge the hijack. There is no proof of anybody being African yet. DuSable attended Catholic school in France. In 1764, DuSable and his boyhood friend Jacques Morgan left Haiti, remember his friend, on the sloop Suzanne and traveled to New Orleans to begin a new life. The following year, the pair, accompanied by a Potawatomi Indian named Choctaw, her name was Choctaw, began the 600-mile journey up the Mississippi River to St. Louis. DuSable had a deep and abiding respect for Native Americans. At times he acted as peacemaker between various warring tribes. The Potawatomis adopted DuSable, okay? They did what? They adopted him as one of their own and allowed the Haitian to marry a young Potawatomi named Catherine, cousin of their chief, Pokagon. As a result, DuSable's trade with the Indians flourished. Because of that, he was able to be the settler and the founder of Chicago and establish commerce there, make that an Indian trading post. That was the only reason, and I'm glad we read that. I wanted to bring this up because I know he's getting all the credit, but he would have never been able to do this if he didn't marry. He had to marry in order to get access to the land, and so that his offspring, his bloodline, can have the inheritance too of the land through the mom, right? Who's a cousin of one of the chiefs, so it's royal blood. Again, as a result, DuSable's trade with the Indians flourished, okay? Flourished. It was his wife, the real founder, Kitihawa. DuSable's traveled up the Mississippi, Illinois, and thus Plains rivers into the Chicago River, where he established a trading post as early as 1772, according to some accounts near what is now Pioneer Court. The post consisted of a bakehouse, a smokehouse, a poultry house, a dairy, a workshop, a barn, and 2 stables. The first child to be born in Chicago was reportedly born at his trading post. The city's first recorded marriage occurred there, as did the first election. It also housed the first city's court and the first post office, okay? A lot of history there. With the assistance of his Indian friends, DuSable, all right, with the assistance of the American Indians, because of them. This is why he was the first settler and founder. Nobody's giving credit to the Indians, though, that were already there and helping them do that. DuSable created a haven on the prairie wilderness. He created a haven. He set aside tracts of land and grew wheat, corn, hay, and alfalfa, and raised dairy and beef cattle, which allowed him to supply meat and dairy products to clients in Detroit. He constructed dairy and cattle barns, a milk house, a blacksmith shop, a poultry house, and a grist mill, okay? All right, so I just want to read that so you guys can understand the impact, right, of him and the American Indians founding Chicago. Moving on, we're going into this book. It's called Jean DuSable, Father of Chicago, by Lawrence Corsetti. I dodged the hijack with this image they have here. So we go to chapter 1 of this book. It says here, Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable was born in Saint Marc, Haiti in 1745. Although a Negro, although he was so-called black, neither he nor his parents suffered hardship because of race. None of them were slaves. For unlike the Spanish or Portuguese, the French had not enslaved all blacks. Their colony in Haiti contained many free Negroes who enjoyed the same freedoms and privileges as other French subjects. And as you guys know, a lot of these so-called free Negroes were the French, black Europeans, and also many American Indians. In fact, France had in 1685 passed the Code Noir, or Code for Blacks, or the Black Codes, right? That insisted on humane treatment for all Negroes, including slaves. So, reference my video on the Black Codes that we read originally. If you guys don't remember, this was applied to Sephardic Jews and Moors on these Caribbean islands. That's who was first applied to these Black Codes. At any rate, Jean DuSable was a free Negro. Either way, he wasn't a slave, okay? His father had been a mate aboard a French privateer that preyed on Spanish merchant ships in the Caribbean, attacks which often triggered retaliation, all right? So because of what his dad was doing and many other pirates. Now, you see, his dad was a pirate. Who are the pirates? We got numerous videos on that as well. Many of these pirates were Sephardic Jews, Moorish people, a lot of Huguenots. In 1755, 3 Spanish men of war sailed into St. Mark Harbor, loosed a heavy bombardment on the port town, and followed up the cannonade by landing troops. The ravaging invaders burned, looted, and killed without mercy. Among the victims of the Spanish assault were the DuSables. Fortunately, a French fleet, warned earlier of the attack on their Haitian port, arrived at St. Mark and routed the Spaniards before they could make off with any prisoners. Jean's father was overcome by grief when he learned what had happened. Now, with a motherless 10-year-old son, he gave up the sea, and with the money earned from his maritime life, bought land, started a coffee and hardwood plantation that soon prospered. The white family named Clemorgan owned the plantation next to the DuSables. All right, so this is conjecture to say these are white people. This is, remember, DuSable's friend that he supposedly went up with, that he grew up with, a Clemorgan. One of their young sons, Jax, grew up as a close friend of Jean. The two boys played, fished, and swam in the warm Caribbean, sailed for pleasure on the blue waters, and attended St. Thomas Catholic School, always together. Their fathers also became close friends, often helping each other on their respective plantations. By the time Jean and Jax had grown to be young men, they were as close as brothers. All right, moving on. Just want to read this book real quick as well. It says here, Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable, founder of Chicago. You see how they show him? And this is written by Shirley Graham. And a bit more ahead in chapter 11, it says here, as Chicago, by the spring of 1774, DuSable persuaded the entire Potawatomi village to move to Chicago with him. His Peoria farm was doing well. Kitihawa managed the farm with the lively assistance of her kinsfolk. This left DuSable free to hunt, trap, and trade. His trading post at Chicago was being talked about. In the summer of 72, DuSable took a band of workers to the portage, cleared a space, and put up a large square building. It was not entirely an Indian structure, nor was it French. It combined some of the best features of each. The logs were peeled and set upright in Indian fashion, but instead of simply leaving a slit in the roof for smoke, DuSable built in a huge stone fireplace, its chimney going up outside the wall. Windows were cut in the logs, the openings covered with dried sheepskin, which admitted light while furnishing protection against wind and rain. The floor was hard packed clay. He contrived benches and tables from logs for Frenchmen and tossed the skins of wolf and grizzly bear on the floor for Indians. Unusual as these features were, it was what he did after the place was all finished that made the talk. He painted a sign in French which said, "Come in and build a fire," after which he signed his full name. He fastened the sign over the door where anyone who passed along the road could see it. Then he took white smooth strips of bark and he drew pictures which would say even more to the Indians. He told who he was, that he was an ally of the great Pontiac, that he welcomed them to his house. He covered the front of the structure with these pictures. He painted on his walls an eagle, sign of his own clan in the Potawatomi, an elk, his wife's sign, and above them an otter, the sign of Pontiac. All right, so We actually skipped over all this info in this video. If you guys want to go over these books that I'm showing you and read them fully, they tell you his time and experience with Chief Pontiac. The first traders who crossed the portage after his lodge was completed stared at it in amazement. When they pushed in the door and saw the great heap of firewood piled beside the fireplace, they could not believe their eyes. For hardly more than 2 months in the year was sleeping under the stars on the portage really pleasant. Now suddenly traders and trappers were presented with comfortable shelter all year round. Whenever DuSable was present, he acted as host, but most of the time he was off somewhere, either hunting, trapping, or fishing, taking goods out for shipment, or attending to his farm. During the winter of 1773-74, he remained in the Great Lakes region throughout the hunting season. When he came out, a Canadian trapper named Lee May was with him, and he had the finest lot of pelts he had ever taken. He returned home to find an infant he left was now a year-old toddler, who at the sight of him ran screaming to his mother. Kitihawa tried to reassure the unhappy father, but DuSable made up his mind right then that he must take his family to Chicago. The village was in a hubbub. The heads of families accepted without question that there was plenty of land, plenty to sustain life, and plenty of fur-bearing creatures in the region. But the portage suffered the evil reputation of being a battleground between tribes, and DuSable was asked to give some assurance on that score. I have made good friends of all the peoples thereabout, he answered. They are welcome in my house. We exchange goods and I consult with them. I have told them I would bring all my family and they are glad. And what about the British? Asked the heads of families. Not once have I seen a redcoat in those parts, declared DuSable. Never did a man move such a family. The caravan which traveled to Chicago moved unmolested across the country. It moved slowly, for there were ox carts as well as horsemen, cows and pigs and chickens and little children. It was the month of June and camping outdoors was delightful, so the trek was not too difficult. Kitihawa was expecting her second child soon, so DuSable turned the trading lodge into a home for her and small Jean Baptiste while he built a new house. He chose the site carefully, remembering that the little ones must not be too near the lake. All documents describe the house he built as a substantial dwelling faced toward the south, having the river directly in front and the lake a short distance to the east. It stood near the present site of the Wrigley Building on the north bank of the Chicago River at Michigan Boulevard. All right, so real quick, since we're talking about his relationship with his wife and his kids and the Indians, let's learn a little bit more about them. It says here in this book, Chicago's authentic founder, Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable, or Haitian secret agent in the Old Northwest Outpost. This is by Mark O. Rozier, okay? All the way in page 203, it says here, the host nation. DuSable entered Chicago when the Potawatomi, or the people of the Place of Fire, ruled the prairie, lakes, and rivers of Illinois. Driven from their original home in the vicinity of Lake Huron, and from the bosom of what Otto Winger termed parent tribe by the Iroquois, so they were driven out by the Iroquois. They had a parent tribe there. The Potawatomi set their sights on northern Michigan. The tribe had scarcely settled down in northern Michigan when another mighty tribe, the Sioux, put them to flight. The displacement forced the tribe into two major branches. The bands that remained in Wisconsin and Michigan became known as Potawatomi of the woods or forest. The branch that moved south to Indiana and Illinois took on the name of Potawatomi of the prairie. The Na-Nosi, as the Potawatomi of the prairie called their forest brethren, evolved in a separate environment and developed very distinct linguistic and medicinal affinities. In his ethnobotany, H. Smith shows that the forest Potawatomi and the prairie Potawatomi were born simultaneously in Ontario, but went their separate ways during the centuries of assault by enemy tribes. The separation that ensued led to the evolution of a separate forest Potawatomi language and the domestication and adaptation of local plants for medicinal application. The Potawatomi was made up of many bands, such as the golden carp, the frog, the crab, and the tortoise. Of the 10 prairie bands, the Muscodans made up 23 clans dwelled in the Chicago area. They were the largest subdivision. Separation from Potawatomi kinfolk and the influence of the Western culture further heightened the characteristics that came to contrast the Potawatomi of the forest and the Potawatomi of the prairie. Often the term Muscutans was also used to refer to the Potawatomi of the prairie. If the Chippewa custom of interviewing and exchanging gifts with newcomers in their midst held true among the Potawatomi, DuSable, though accompanied by his wife and children, might have been interviewed by the village chiefs and told in no uncertain terms that he was expected to prove his loyalty. The Potawatomi chiefs might adopt or assign him to a family as a war trophy. The timing could not be any more perfect for him to meet such a challenge. According to Thomas G. Conway, the Potawatomi were experiencing a political crisis around the 1700s. By the time DuSable entered the lakefront, the crisis had sent the bands into disarray. Separated by distance, prairie, and forest, the various bands and clans could not consolidate their forces. Soon enough, the lack of political cohesion proved detrimental. They were easily persuaded by opposite forces and powers to support causes that resulted in their deaths and economic ruins. No strong and undefined warrior who could command obedience emerged at this critical juncture, leaving a vacuum that threatened to undermine the tribe's sovereignty and existence. This leadership vacuum might have been what DuSable sought to fill with his bid for the chieftainship. All right, remember he tried to be chief, knowing full well the tribe's potential to be a mighty and independent nation, and for the love he had for them, he tried to rally the bands behind him to harness the energy so that the Fire Nation his son and daughter were to inherit would be one of strength. The idea of complete takeover of the village of Chicago had not yet entered his mind. It is difficult to identify which specific clan DuSable married into since his wife's area of origin is not known. Her traditional native name, given as Kitihawa or flight, provides no helpful hint as to her specific affinity. If she was from Illinois, she probably belonged to the prairie rather than the forest division of the tribe. Musketeans, wrote Strong, formerly dwelt about the southern end of Lake Michigan, with their main town at the site of modern Chicago. Potawatomi held land in the Pine Creek, Indiana as well, where DuSable was found to own a home. He might have become acquainted with her tribe in Peoria, where there was a Potawatomi settlement. John Reynolds stumbled upon this Potawatomi village in Peoria during the War of 1812. We had guides along who conducted the army to the village of Potawatomi Indians, known as the Black Partridge Village, situated at the Illinois Bluffs, nearly opposite the upper end of Peoria Lake. We camped within 4 or 5 miles of the village, and all was silent as a graveyard. And right before we end this, I just want to read this magazine, Ebony Magazine. This is from the December issue of 1963, and this is the cover right here. It says here, Negro who founded Chicago. DuSable was city's first permanent settler by Leron Bennett Jr. Chicago, as the Indians called it, was not a very promising place. It was damp, flat, and odorous, and the weather was impossible. Great blasts of heat from the open prairie were succeeded in turns by icy blasts of air from the lake. All right, so just interesting picture here, how they show this was part of DuSable's land. You see the white line here, all this. That was part of where he had the homestead or the trading post. You can see now it's part of in the middle of the city, all right, Chicago. And here are some of the places mentioned today. You see Chicago here, Peoria, Cahokia, where he got married, Michigan City, St. Joseph up here in Michigan, Port Huron, Mackinac, Milwaukee, Green Bay up here, all around Lake Michigan. So describing him as a broad-shouldered man named Jean-Baptiste Pointe Du Sable, who described himself as a free Negro on the north bank of the Chicago River near the site of the present Tribune Towers. DuSable built the first permanent home in Chicago. Starting from scratch with nothing working for him but hope and faith, he made a Chicago commercial center. He was the first builder in Chicago, the first wholesaler, the first meat packer, the first merchant prince, the first Chicagoan, in fact, and a man worthy of the deed. All right, so Obviously, the Indians were doing all that before he arrived there, so he wasn't the first. They're talking about European. In the fullness of time, DuSable's dream became the flesh of other men's legends. His seed, the original settlement, became a forest of concrete and steel. The canoes that stopped at this door gave way to locomotives and ships. His trading posts became mail order houses and department stores. His workshop, factories, and mills. White men came from Ireland and Germany and Sweden, and black men came from the south to sit in the wind of his dream. But only a handful of them knew Chicago's deepest and best kept secret. Its father is a Negro. On land DuSable, once owned by right of toil, stand today the Gothic Tribune Towers, Philip Wrigley's Wrigley Building, the Palmolive Building in Chicago's Magnificent Mile, one of the richest real estate bubbles in the world. A part of the original DuSable estate, now recorded as the Kinsey Edition, includes the incredibly rich real estate from the bank of the Chicago River north to Chicago Avenue and from State Street east to the lake. It has been estimated that the original DuSable estate is worth today at least $1 billion. DuSable's original title and his place in history rest on incontrovertible evidence, a deed recorded in the Wayne County Courthouse in Detroit, contemporary reports of British officers, the journals, daybooks, and reminiscences of travelers and traders. Most contemporary documents incidentally refer to DuSable as wealthy and well-educated. His name is spelled variously as Ausable, DuSable, DuSable, and DuSable. Milo M. Coffey, the authority on the early history of the Great Lakes region, supports DuSable's claim with massive documentation. So does Father Thomas A. Meehan, a Roman Catholic scholar. Despite this weighty testimony, Chicagoans deal gingerly with the skeleton in their closet. The black pioneer is not yet honored in his own house, which Chicagoans call the Kinsey House, or on his own land. No street bears his name, and save for the high school, he has no monument. Cadillac is honored in Detroit, Pitt in Pittsburgh, Cleveland in Cleveland, but the father of Chicago has no street or statue of stone to call his own. Though unsung, DuSable is far from forgotten. His spirit haunts Chicago. In recent months, his name has become a battle cry for his sociological sons who say, not without a certain humor, that things were a great deal simpler before the so-called white people came, or the Europeans. Who was DuSable? From whence did he come? The first question is easy. DuSable was a pioneer, one of that long line of Negro and white men who conquered this country. 6 feet tall, handsome, of pleasant mien and disposition, he had qualities that recommend him to every American. He was industrious, imaginative, and enterprising. As a trapper, trader, farmer, and entrepreneur, he left an incredible mark on the history of America's second largest city. Although he was a Negro, although he was so-called black, what does that have to do with anything, huh? And seemed to be proud of it, and he was very proud of it. He was the product of a French environment, okay? Okay? Even though he was so-called black, he was a product of French. And yet he was a man of the world, speaking not only French, but also English, Spanish, and several Indian dialects. Thus, throughout this decade, DuSable maintained excellent connections with the Potawatomi Indians. To the Indians, he was a brother, counselor, and leader. Tradition says that he sought unsuccessfully the chieftainship of the Potawatomi Indians. Surrounded by his children and grandchildren and his houses and fields, DuSable, the wealthy merchant, passed over into the autumn of life. Leaves fell from the trees, the wind whistled and hollowed on the lake. Winters and summers passed, and DuSable's wealth, and for all we know, his contentment grew. Then a very strange thing happened. On May 18, 1800, he sold his holdings, which would be worth $1,000,000,000 today, for about 1,200, and moved on. Why? Some historians say he moved on to a new adventure, or that he was picked by his failure to be elected an Indian chief. Others say he was in ill health. Still others say he moved or was forced to move because Dixie had come to the Midwest. All right, so all of a sudden, he just left all that. And right here on the right, you have a copy of his cell, of his law that says, I, Jean Baptiste Pointe Du Sable, hereby certifies, having sold of my free will and consent all the property I have in Chicago, and furthermore undertake to give to Mr. Jean Lalime or his representatives all the articles mentioned above according to the inventory made in Chicago on May 7th, 1800. All right, so, all of a sudden he's getting rid of everything. These facts add to the mystery of DuSable's sudden departure. Was he forced to sell, or did he see the handwriting on the wall? At this point, we can only guess. All we know is that he moved on, first to Peoria and then to St. Charles, Missouri, where he died in poverty on August 28, 1819. Remember, he went back to his supposed friend, Clamorgan, all right, to die over there. The man who bought DuSable's Chicago fared little better. Lalime was stabbed to death in Chicago by John Kinsey. You see, John Kinsey, the one they were trying to make the founder, he killed somebody. He murdered to take that. You see that? I didn't know that. Who said he acted in self-defense. Kinsey's later life, like DuSable's, was clouded by business reverses and want. The spirit of DuSable and Kinsey lives on in contemporary Chicago, where about 1 out of every 4 persons is a Negro. DuSable and Kinsey tell us that black and white men collaborated and fought and won and lost in the taking of the West. Although only Kinsey is honored today, DuSable's claim gains force with every rising of the sun. In a peculiarly prophetic way, he symbolizes the past and the future of a city which was born integrated. Of this man and of this city, the Potawatomi Indians used to smile and say, the first white man to settle in Chicago was a Negro. All right, that's deep. All right, the first so-called white man, because remember, it's all about status, so-called free whites. Who's the free whites? It also included people of color. The first white man in Chicago was a Negro. All right, remember, forget that. All right, we just want to read this article real quick before we left today. And this is also in the website, theroot.com. It says the first white man in Chicago was a Negro. Huh? Yeah, and I went to findagrave.com and I actually found his graveyard, as it says here, memory of Jean Baptiste Pointe Du Sable, right? That article from Ebony we just read is interesting because in the 1960s, he still wasn't accepted as the founder. You know, as time went on, you know, eventually they just recently started accepting him and making it official that he was the actual founder. And that's why this video is very important. Guys, I hope you guys enjoyed it. What I do want to say before I leave today is, you know, I keep saying Black French. He might be indigenous as well, but it appears he's more French. You know, his mom might have been indigenous. They don't know. All they know is that she was a free person of color. A lot of these websites would say she was an African slave, and that's not what the primary sources say. Primary sources, as we read today, that he descended from a free person of color and a French privateer. We know who the pirates were. We got to dodge the hijack. We know about the Huguenots. We know about the Black French. We know all this, guys, Black Europeans. So it's conjecture to say his dad is white or his slave master or anything like that. And it's also conjecture to say that his mom is from Africa. But for example, when I picture his parents, this is what I picture, guys, right here. You know, a pirate, a French pirate, privateer, and so his indigenous mom possibly might have some French blood in her too, Sephardic Jewish blood there. That's why I'm saying he most likely is more French than anything. And it's conjecture to say he's so-called black just because they are conjecturing that his mom is African. So dodge the hijack big time, all right? Again, this is what you should picture when you picture his parents. That's what I picture. You know how they try to portray Jack Sparrow and these Pirates of the Caribbean, he got dreadlocks. But yeah, it's Johnny Depp, right? Johnny Depp with dreadlocks, right? But this is more logical right here, what you're seeing. So that was one of the main points of this presentation, just to let you know that yes, it was a so-called black man that founded Chicago. You can't just say he was half African because that hasn't been proven. The primary sources don't mention anything about anybody being African. So don't add that conjecture, assumption, or opinion to the history. Jean Baptiste Pointe Du Sable is most likely one of those black Europeans that they had a hard time hiding in history. And his involvement and possible bloodline with American Indians is also not talked about, not emphasized. Hope you guys enjoyed this little presentation on Jean Baptiste Pointe Du Sable. And I hope that from now on you honor and remember the real, original founder of Chicago. Once again, thanks for sticking around till the end and hearing me read and present the information. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Hawa.